Welcome to Your Next Chapter, where we feature conversations with leading audio creators and industry experts shaping the future of podcasting. I'm Jeremiah Tittle, CEO of Next Chapter Podcasts, and your host for insightful conversations that delve into the creative processes, challenges, and innovations driving the world of audio storytelling. And our guest for this episode is practically a celebrity to podcast industry folks. James Cridland is the editor of PodNews and Podcast Business Journal. He's worked in audio for over 3 decades and is the leading voice for podcast industry news and analysis. James, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for asking. It's very kind.
Our pleasure to have you. And, I'd like to start off by asking you about your whereabouts. So we were talking before the conversation today about the fact that you're based in Brisbane in Australia. And I was just wondering what it's like for you to have this kind of global following with your finger on the pulse of the podcast industry and be based there.
Well, I used to be, so I've as you can tell from my very British accent, I moved here about 7 or 8 years ago. So I used to live in the UK, but yes, it's a long way away from everywhere. As I should know, if I'm sounding a little bit croaky, it's because I flew a red eye this morning from Malaysia, where I was at a podcast conference. So it's a long way away from everywhere else, but it's a good place to be otherwise.
No, I believe that. And I'm just curious a little bit more as we talk about the global nature of this industry. Being from the US and spending most of my life in the United States, we have a very myopic view, perhaps, of the industry. And maybe you have a better sense of how consumption habits across the world, I'm not asking you necessarily to focus on the US exactly, but I understand that Australia does have quite a history of audio storytelling, radio. I come from radio in the US, originally from Washington, D.C., but I've moved around a bunch. And I went to my first podcast show in London in May, and it was just a very refreshing opportunity for me to meet some folks from different parts of the globe that are very much obsessed with this industry, as am I. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on maybe region by region and how it's been for you being in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's very different in every single country, of course. And I think, that's the interesting thing. The UK is doing pretty well, as you would have seen when you went to the podcast show in London, with the BBC being a prominent part of the audio industry there. Has put an awful lot of money into the audio industry. Of course, the US and Canada are doing really well. Actually, here in Australia, we have more listening to podcasts than you guys do. So they do say that we're leading the world. I'm not so sure about that, but nevertheless, it is interesting looking at different countries and in different places. And I was looking after the Podcast Day Asia conference recently, and that was fascinating because, different countries are very much on a different journey. Places like the Philippines have an awful lot of podcast listening. My typical yardstick is if you have a look at a top 10 chart from a particular country, if it's got a lot of reheated radio in it, if it's got a lot of, the 96.2 breakfast show or whatever it might be, then you know that the industry isn't quite as developed as others. But so it is fascinating seeing all of the differences in all of the different countries around the world. But certainly where the growth is right now, arguably, is in those countries. It's not in the US or the UK or indeed here anymore, because there is far more growth to go in other countries around the world.
And I love that kind of measuring stick. I think that's really a wise way to look at it. But I'm wondering about the factors beyond that go into kind of the health or maturation of a particular market is, in Australia, we recently on one of our podcasts, The 500 with Josh Adam Myers, had Bill Burr on to celebrate our 300th episode, talking about AC/DC Highway to Hell, which
Oh yeah.
apparently is about what the highway is it from Perth to, I forget the other end of that highway, but
Oh yeah. Probably Perth to Adelaide or to
Adelaide, I
Melbourne.
think.
But yes, yeah, no,
Yeah.
indeed.
The point
Uh,
being that there's a lot of road to cover in a
oh
big
yeah.
country as Australia is. So, big markets in the US like LA, maybe Atlanta, you could pinpoint where people are guaranteed to be stuck in traffic for a minimum of 1 hour.
Yeah.
So, as the on demand attractiveness of a podcast over listening to your local radio with 7 minutes of commercials every 25
Mm.
minutes or what have you. Um, how much do you attribute to the kind of terrain of a particular place? I've been to London a couple of times in the last year, and getting from the airport from Heathrow to my friend's place took an hour and a half. So I wonder about the nature of consumption habits in certain places and how that dictates,
Yeah.
kind of a more ample or a more fertile ground for podcasts over radio.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And next time you should use the Elizabeth line. It's nice and fast. It gets you virtually anywhere. So I think, yes, there is, there are really interesting differences in different countries. What we tend to find is that if you look at the, where people are listening to podcasts, the number one place is actually at home. And it's normally, whether you're getting ready to go to bed or go to sleep, or whether you're doing the cooking or all of those things. But clearly, the car is an important thing as well. And it's the mainstay of radio, and it's also a pretty large place in terms of podcast listening. And obviously the benefit of a podcast is that you can enjoy the podcast while your eyes are busy. So, you can do all of the driving that you like, and a podcast will actually give you that. Interestingly, that's one of the reasons I'm told why podcasts aren't as big yet in Vietnam as they should be. And quite a lot of that is due to the fact that most people drive motorbikes rather than cars in Vietnam. And also, secondly, they are trying to stay alive on the roads, which is a different thing than perhaps we have. So, so I think that certainly has an effect. I think also just the range of content is an important thing just to bear in mind. There aren't that many, podcasts, for example, in Welsh. And if the only language that you speak is Welsh, which is a vanishingly small amount of people, but nevertheless, if the only podcast that you speak if the only language that you speak is Welsh, then the amount of content that you have is rather a lot smaller. And so when you have a look at places like Scandinavia, like Norway or Sweden, then you can very clearly see that there is a lot of listening to local language content, but there is also a lot of listening to English content as well. Where countries don't necessarily speak English too much, you do see a bit of a drop off in terms of podcast consumption. So there are, all of these fascinating, reasons why podcasting is bigger in some countries and smaller, in others. And in fact, you can have a look in Korea, for example, where podcasting got tremendously successful some time ago, much sooner than in the US, much sooner than in many other countries. And that was because there was a really big hit that was quite negative towards the current government, in a way that Koreans were unused to hearing on their broadcast media. And so that was actually a real blip early on of a podcast making all kinds of allegations. That podcast no longer exists. And almost you could see that there's been a bit of a decline in podcast listening since, because the content isn't there, for Koreans to get what they wanted. So it all comes down to a variety of different things, and that is certainly and that is certainly one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, well, your recent example, I mean, the most, maybe biggest inflection point for the US was Serial. It really brought so many people, out of this mindset, as I was thumbing my nose at the podcast industry, coming from radio, Sirius XM,
Yeah.
where I just thought that everything we were doing was special and different and setting ourselves apart from radio. But podcasting had become that, and the investigative journalism aspect, where this wild, wild west, which has its the downsides, the upside is that journalists, could kind of get out of this big brand news journalistic, machine, and still have their two plus sources, but approach stories that maybe the judicial system had failed folks, the prison industrial complex, and all of that in the U.S. It was very important, I think, on Spotlight and being
Yeah.
exposed through Serial, and many others like Atlanta Monster and now Monster with Tenderfoot TV behind that. But I want to go back to
Yeah.
earlier, and you can comment on that, but I just wanted to go back to your first comment, which was that most people are consuming at home. And that's very much I think a pandemic driven, phenomenon. And so now I want to ask you kind of the health of the industry overall, as you have your finger on the pulse here. How do you view the recent period of podcasting? Are we clear of the market correction? Do you see it as a market correction? After all the funny money and acquisitions were taking place in the industry 4 more years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are certainly clear of we're clear of the bubble. We're clear of the madness that was going on with people buying, a lot of very expensive podcasts. In many cases, spending an awful lot of money launching a podcast that never actually completed. Surprising how many shows, for example, Spotify announced but never actually launched. Which I always found, a fascinating thing. We're certainly clear of that, and I think partially that was people from traditional media assuming that they understood how podcasts worked, assuming it was just like television in the main, except without any pictures. And but that's basically how it would work. So they would sling lots of money at it and assume that it worked in that way. And I think they found that no, it doesn't work that way. That podcasting is a very different medium. And surprise, surprise, it's quite hard to make great audio, audio that keeps people coming back again and again and again. And it's particularly hard to do that in a way that that gives you the sort of the habit that you need to run a successful show. I'm still very surprised by the amount of people who are contacting me and saying, we've just launched this brilliant 8-episode long show. And I'm there thinking, I mean, eight episodes long is not going to be enough to get people into the habit of listening to that particular show. You look at things like Joe Rogan, that is years and years and years old. More than 10 years old. And the reason why it's so successful is that there are people who listen to Joe Rogan at a specific time every single week, maybe when they're doing the supermarket shopping, maybe when they're out, jogging or walking the dog, but there is a particular time when they listen to that show. And that is why that show comes out as regularly as it does. And so I think, there's that difference there. What I would also say is that we probably had two market corrections. We had the market correction first of people realizing that they were spending an awful lot of money in ways that wasn't a particularly clever plan. And quite a lot of that was Spotify and their exclusive deals and all of that, which has been proven not really to have worked particularly well. But then you had the second market correction of Apple making some quite significant changes in their Apple Podcasts app, which essentially meant that the amount of downloads for major podcasts dipped anywhere from 15% to 25%. And of course, if the downloads dip that much, then you end up finishing a podcast without actually delivering to the advertiser what the advertiser had bought. And so there was a lot of pain caused by that particular change. And I think, now that we've gone through two of those corrections, I think the industry is in a much more, is in a much better place. Having said that, lots of big deals so far this year, many big deals over $100 million. And you have to kind of ask where some of these people, particularly Amazon's Wondery, which has put their hands in their pocket an awful lot this year, you have to ask quite how they're going to get their money back from that. But perhaps they're playing a longer game than we think.
When you talk about the star power of SmartLess, these three actors can command the type of money that they got in this podcast deal in a film or TV role without much effort. And then when it comes to another show that was born out of the pandemic, three friends talking to each other about, dropping off the kids at school and stuff you don't get access like this to these famous people. And then having phenomenal interviews, clearly, with folks that you, again, don't get access to. So there is a real value there, but that's you actually started down the road of my next question, which you pretty much answered. But the recent big money announcements, Call Her Daddy, New Heights, Armchair Experts, I think was at 80 million. So you're dubious that the return on investment for these big networks will actually come to pass or will be in the black. And I guess my follow-up is because I was a part of the Sirius and XM radio battle pre-merger. I was on the XM side before working for Sirius XM for about 5 years. And it was a space race in the U.S. And I don't know how closely you followed that because it's not an international story. But I'm just curious about your thoughts on these talents are going to be gobbled up by someone, but is it a factor of the agencies and those doing these business deals who are driving these numbers up for their benefit, and the networks have no choice but to spend Jeff Bezos's money in this audio space because they need to have a solution for their sales team?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? You can certainly see that. So in the example of Joe Rogan, for example, the way that Spotify used Joe Rogan is advertisers would come flocking in and say, we would like to advertise on Joe Rogan's show. And they would say, yes, that's absolutely fine. That's a network buy. And you buy Joe Rogan along with Podcast X, Podcast Y, and Podcast Z. And that's the only way that you get into the Joe Rogan show, which is a very clever way of selling the network. And that's the way that, any decent podcast network should be selling. So you certainly have, that going on. And so therefore, I think you do need big names to get some advertisers interested in what you have. Then you can actually show them, well, yeah, I know you want to advertise on, Howard Stern, but actually there are all of these other channels. There's all these other programs that you should be advertising on as well. So if the big star gets you through the door as an advertiser, then actually it's then the network's job to sell that wider. So I can kind of get that. The New Heights one is particularly interesting because that is very much a flash in the pan. The figures for that show went up 4.5 times after Travis Kelce announced his relationship with Taylor Swift. and the audience changed from being 2/3 male to 50% female. Now, that to me says that there are a lot of people listening to that show just so that they can hear Taylor's cat mewing in the background rather than anything else. And there's going to be probably quite a lot of teenage girls listening to that particular show. And, how monetizable is that going to be? And what happens if Travis Kelce becomes ex-boyfriend number 13? Because that may well happen at some point. So there's a question mark around that particular show in comparison to Call Her Daddy, which is a great buy by the company, long running show which has done tremendously well and has really pointed to to a clever future of both running a great podcast show, but also doing some TV work, doing some work in terms of live shows and everything else. So I think it'll be interesting seeing how those two shows in particular, end up working.
I'm glad you called it out, and we can go a little deeper into it. I actually listened to my first episode of Call Her Daddy this week. Hunter Schafer from Euphoria. Right. Was on the show, and I was like, okay, this will get me listening because I know nothing about her, but I'm intrigued, or them, and that's mostly because I did test Barstool, so that's really where that comes from. But on the New Heights conversation, which I find intriguing, the thing that you're forgetting is that as soon as Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift break up, she's going to write an album about him. And so there's going to be some halo effect there. So I hope you don't mind that I make that point. And
no, maybe. No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And, recently talking to a prospective client, conversation was around how do I, in the sea of content, and we know that the number of active podcasts over the overall number that is out in the universe for podcasts that exist is, you probably know the percentage better than me, but what is it, 20% or something?
It's 350,000. So 2.7 million podcasts in Apple's directory right now, and about 350,000 that have been updated over the last 30 days. But still, that's still 350,000. That's rather more choice than you have on your radio dial, even on a Sirius XM radio dial. So I think from that point of view, you still need to cut through. You need to be there when audiences are expecting you to be there, which is an important part of that. But you also need to cut through in terms of what your content is, whether or not you are offering something that other people aren't. And that might be a big name, but it might also be just some fantastic content that nobody else has. It's harder to break through now if you're a no name, if nobody knows who you are. But that's not to say it's impossible at all. But it's the same. Nobody really complains about there being too many books out there. Nobody, complains about there being too many TV shows. So it's much the same, sort of conversation, I think, of just finding a niche, looking for that niche, and then producing some great content for that particular community. And part of that these days, I think, maybe beginning to have a look at more local shows, more hyper-local shows, because I think the amount of podcast listeners now out there makes a local show looking at a particular city, looking at a particular place, a more viable thing than it's ever been. So perhaps there's things there, but there are plenty of shows out there which are incredibly niche in terms of there was a story, I think, in the Wall Street Journal only the other week about a particularly successful show which is all about air conditioning equipment. And you think, goodness me, really? But no, this guy, he has all of the air conditioning equipment buyers listening to that particular show. All of the air conditioning equipment people want to buy into that show. It's a tremendously important show for that community. And, Yes, it might not be broadcast, and perhaps that's the difference, and perhaps that's what Spotify didn't really understand. It's not going to drive massive numbers, but it's definitely going to drive a massive percentage of that community that you want to end up attracting. Whether or not there's advertising in there, whether or not you do it in terms of sponsorship, whether or not you're doing it in terms of branded podcasts, but there's real opportunity, I think, in focusing on a small community of common interest, or indeed a small local community, which of course is just one of those as well.
Sounds like a modern day car talk, but air talk, perhaps. Sorry, I don't know
Yes.
the name of the show, but that's a great anecdote, and I think we can agree that more choice is better for the industry, for a
Yeah.
specific show or someone who's considering getting into podcasting. Everyone has a story.
Yeah.
Not everybody has the best voice. Not everybody's famous or has a social clout that whatever modeling that a Spotify development finance person might look at a particular piece of content and say, this is good value. We need to, put an offer together, and this is what it should look like. To that point, and you have a phenomenal ability to answer the next question that I'm about to ask you. But in this case, I wanted to kind of double down on this new perspective podcaster. I think a lot of people are intimidated. They feel like it's, again, we talked about the sea of content, but beyond that, how do I stand out and be different? And the first thing I say is, well, you're not looking for the most amount of people most of the time, which was always the radio and I'm sure TV edict
Yeah.
for programmers and beyond executives. But in this case, you just shared a great anecdote about finding the right audience, getting the right advertisers, and then I'd say beyond having a compelling or entertaining personality, what would you say about the concept of a show, the format for a show? Just a quick personal story is our first network deal was with Spotify, a licensing deal for the 500 with Josh Adam Myers. And it was really the format of the show, the ambitious, when Josh first called me and said, hey, I have an idea for a show. It's going to be counting down Rolling Stone magazine's 500 greatest albums of all time. And I said, Josh, you're crazy, because that's going to take us almost 10 years to do 500 weeks of content. We built the format. We have new music at the end of the show inspired by that album that particular week. We have kind of an opening segment that gives a history of the album and the artist. And so that format and that building, which I think is much more of at least a content or radio strategy for content. What would you say to someone new who maybe is an expert in a field, but is looking to kind of build out a format that's compelling in a niche?
Yeah, and I think you've described something that your history in radio has informed how to make that sort of show work fantastically well. It's a very important thing to think about. Okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to break this down? And what can we do to keep audience interest all the way through? And there's a bunch of fascinating statistics that you can get, whether it's from Apple, whether it's from Spotify, where you can actually see where people are listening, when people skip, when people jump, because they're not interested in what they're listening to right now. All of that kind of information is hidden away in there, and that's super useful. I mean, far more useful than, I've got a radio background as well, and far more useful than any of the radio figures that we used to get, is actually seeing exactly minute by minute what people are doing. So there's a bunch of that. But I think, at the end of the day, the successful podcasts that I see are consistent. So they are always out every single week or every single day, or, well, there's probably only those two, every single week or every single day, because otherwise you can't build up a habit. So I think consistency of release is an important thing. And I think consistency of content is therefore an important thing as well. You know what you're going to get when you go back to it. Those are very typical radio tricks that we would that we would use. You certainly wouldn't have. I mean, there are a few radio stations in Europe that work this way, but you certainly wouldn't have a different breakfast presenter every day, during the week, because no one would get that relationship going with that person who's on the air. So having that consistent, feel is a really important thing. So I think, that's certainly one side. And the other thing that I would say is learn to edit. There are a lot of people who will press record, make a podcast, or, talk to somebody or whatever, press the stop button at the end, and then maybe a producer will top and tail it. I would have called it in the olden days. Would have made sure that it goes in and comes out okay, and that's basically it. That's fine, but actually there are going to be questions that don't land. There are going to be things that don't quite work. There are going to be potentially the order of the questions that you asked, you might wish to switch around at some point. We're so lucky now that instead of editing on reel-to-reel tape, as I was doing when I was learning how to edit interviews, we're so lucky that now we can quite literally look at the words in a Word document using a tool like Descript or Edit by Headliner. Look at the words in a Word document, cut and paste, get rid of the interview questions that didn't work, and it will do the audio editing for you. Incredibly lucky in terms of where we are, and it comes down to I'm often asked, what is the ideal duration for a podcast?
Yeah,
and my answer to that is always as long as it needs to be, but not a second longer. Getting rid of all of the dead wood is a really important thing. So certainly worthwhile doing.
Phenomenal answer. And I wholeheartedly agree. So question about your story. We've talked about, your background a little bit in media. But I am curious about how you got started with PodNews and Podcast Business Journal. I'm sure you've seen it grow a lot over time, but how did it all begin for you?
Yeah, well, I was at a radio conference of all places. I was at the International, what was it called? No, the Worldwide Radio Summit in Los Angeles. And I think that year I was the worldwide along with a man called Ben. And so that was great fun. And there was a friend of mine in the bar afterwards, and he was saying, James, where do you get your podcast news from? Now, I've been writing a newsletter all about radio and international radio trends for a long, long, long time. And I thought to myself, there isn't anywhere, is there, to get podcast news from? I wonder whether that's something that I can do, whether that's something that I can help the industry with. And so got home, found a domain name, just sort of launched something, see what works, what didn't. So that was back in May of 2017, and and I've been doing it pretty well ever since. I'm very lucky in that I'm sort of relatively techie. The jobs that I've had in the past have been both content driven in terms of writing things, but also technical in terms of writing the code to make that stuff show up on a web page and all of that kind of thing. So so I've built quite a lot of my own tools to help me do it. But that's sort of how I got into it. So that was May of 2017, and right now, I think 32,000 people are getting that newsletter every single day. Many more getting the podcast version. because I got bored of people asking me, "What's your podcast?" and my replying, "I didn't have one." And I thought that's probably not a very good answer, is it? So I ended up doing that. But and then further 10,000 people getting the Podcast Business Journal, which was a product that we bought from its previous owner a couple of years ago now. And that's really our weekly look into the business of podcasting, very much focused on not on creators, but on those people who are, selling advertising and in that sort of side of it. So, very much been part of that for the last however long that is, 7 years or so. And really enjoying it. But I think, I'm at this sort of weird position where I've worked with a lot of US companies. I've worked with a lot of companies in Canada, across Europe, and of course in the UK and here in Australia. So I'm very aware of the different sort of markets that exist. And I think, therefore, that I can hopefully bring something which is a little bit less focused on, Brooklyn, which historically podcast newsletters have always been, and focus on, everything that's actually going on in the industry, across the world. And obviously, being a lazy British person, I only speak one language, so you will get a lot of the English bias, but nevertheless, at least that's a start, I think, into where we're going.
Absolutely. No, I love that. One thing I've noticed just from some of your answers and just talking to you is, you're not afraid to go to the conference. You're not afraid to go to, I guess it's the nature of what you've done, but this travel, it really gives you unique insight into a bunch of different markets that people don't have access to. And I have to say, PodNews and Podcast Business Journal are must reads for me. This is the industry I work in and make my livelihood off of and just enjoy, because of all the restrictions of radio that I was raised on, to have them released and to have an entrepreneur be able to try and figure out this wild, wild west that is getting less wild. Maybe it's just one wild west now. So I'm just curious, has that always been your attitude, to go to the place, to meet the person, to travel around the world, if it even if you don't know it's going to work out?
Yeah, traveling around the world is a lovely thing to do, and I super enjoy. I super enjoy doing that. At the moment, I'm slightly regretting it because I've got rather a lot of long economy flights in the next few weeks. But I've always spoken at conferences. I've always got on very well with other speakers at conferences and tried to give good value. I've organised a number of conferences as well. So really, hopefully I can add to those particular conferences that I end up going to. But so that's always great fun to do, and also going to visit places. So with your background at Sirius XM, I remember going to the XM radio factory in Washington DC, and walking down a corridor and just seeing radio studio upon radio studio upon radio studio, and thinking, wow, this is the future. It's a tremendous change. But I've been very lucky to be working with lots of different people and to understand, why the Canadian market is so different to the US market, and why both of those markets are so different to the UK or to Ireland or to Singapore or Thailand, which is a fascinating market. And so all of that, I think, has been really useful and helpful in being able to understand the differences in particular markets. Is an important thing. I think I'm going in a couple of weeks' time to Dubai, to a podcast conference there, where the Arab nations are just grabbing podcasting now and going, this is our future. We really want this. Yeah. And the amount of growth in podcasting in that part of the world is significantly increasing. And of course, what we have done, the podcast industry have done, is if you want to publish a podcast, then the first thing that you have to do is learn English, because pretty well every podcast host is not translated into Arabic, is not translated into many languages other than perhaps, if you're really lucky, French and Spanish. And so, there are real opportunities in those markets, but it does mean that all of our back-end infrastructure all has to be translated into Arabic, into other languages, into some of the Southeastern Asian languages, and that will really see us grow, I think, in the future.
Yeah, and not without its faults. One of my favorite panels at Podcast Show in London was on AI translations.
Oh, yes.
Something that we have a Shakespeare series, which is more modernized, hopefully more accessible Shakespeare stories being told in different settings and times. Right now we have As You Like It, about to wrap up, which is set in the summer of love, late 60s, flower
Nice.
power.
Okay. Yeah.
But we've been thinking about and talking to folks that we met from the panel in London about the possibility of translating to a handful of different languages. How would that, grow the exposure for the content? How would it further the mission of our benefactors and supporters with the Hits Foundation and Play on Shakespeare to get these tremendous stories told more accessibly, less thick old English, turns of phrase that don't really land. But then how do you do that in Spanish? And people have been telling me that Brazil is this huge podcasting market. So Portuguese becomes very important too now, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it does. And I think, there are technical solutions to help with that, but I don't think AI is the solution, because you do still need to check it in terms of culture and to explain things. I mean, I was at a training session for one of the local radio stations here a while back, and I was playing some English radio to them, some radio from the UK to them. And I had to go in and say, right, you're just about to hear a telephone call on the air, and it's a man who's talking about his blue badge. So let me explain what a blue badge is, first of all. Because in the UK, a blue badge is a little badge that you have in your car to say that you are disabled, maybe you're in a wheelchair, maybe you have trouble walking. And so a blue badge is what you put in your car, and you can park in those spaces in the car parks. It's not called a blue badge here. So I need to explain that before I go into it. It's just those little bits of culture that AI is not going to pick up on. And so, I was listening to a fascinating story about an Indonesian podcast that was translated into English last week, and again, some really interesting hard work that they ended up doing, of both using AI as the first draft, but then actually, using proper voice actors to act it completely, making sure that all of the cultural references were right, making sure that things were explained, making sure that some parts were changed because they weren't landing in that particular language. All of those are really interesting, but there is certainly an awful lot of growth, I think. And there are particular companies, one's based out of Copenhagen in Denmark, whose job is to take hit shows and to translate those into other languages and make money out of them. And I think that's a fascinating side of where we are.
Yeah, it is. And you'll note that we haven't decided to move forward with it, I think, based on those challenges. It doesn't mean that we won't ever. I really appreciate your analysis on this and everything else that we've talked about today. Just to wrap up things, we asked every guest this question, and it's in the name of the show, but what's your next chapter? What's next for your career? What are you excited about?
Well, I would like to do something. I'd like to do something in terms of the PodNews newsletter to grow something which is aimed at podcast listeners rather than just people who work inside podcasting, which would of course be rather a bigger thing. So that's, on a very basic level, one of the next things that I would like to end up doing. But I guess I was thinking that my current airline, they're telling me that I am about a year and a half away from lifetime gold.
Ooh.
So when I hit lifetime gold, that's actually a moment for me, because that's a moment for me going, do I really need to do all of this travel anymore? Do I actually get to turn around and say no rather a lot more than I have been doing in the past? Are there opportunities for me just to sort of, see a bit more of this place rather than see the inside of economy class flights. So, so I think that that's an interesting time. I'm sure that for most people, it's a significant birthday, like 55 or 60, when they're kind of thinking, okay, what do I do for the next 10 years? For me, it seems not to be that. It seems to be more a lifetime goal thing from the airline. It just gives you pause to think, okay, well, what is next? And so I think that's going to be an interesting think over the next 18 months or so to work out what it is that I would really like to end up doing. And maybe it's to continue doing the PodNews newsletter for many more years, but perhaps not to do quite so many flying. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Who knows? But, it's always an interesting thing just to sort of have a think about.
Well, may you be on Economy Plus from that day forward. I'm not sure what the benefits are of the lifetime gold, but I'm envious, my friend. Every year it's a celebration.
It means lounges and things, yeah.
Oh, well, come on now. Please pass the bubbly. Well, that sounds like something to look forward to, and I would absolutely celebrate it. Every year it's a big moment when I get Alaska Airlines, which is a little bit more germane to my kind of West Coast living up until recently. Yes. So I've moved to Spain recently, and I have to figure out, once I get some kind of residency, that I've been told I have €5 flights in my future. So maybe that's my version of your lifetime goal.
Well, yes. And of course, the beauty of places like Spain is that you are so close to the rest of Europe. Instead of thinking, shall I go to the United States again today, or the United States again, or maybe even Canada, brave Canada, you have so many choices. So that's going to be a wonderful thing, I think.
I don't think that phrase, and I know I'm alienating a lot of our potential listeners, but brave Canada has not been uttered, at least on this show, before. So it's not one that we'll say in the U.S. Too often, but very entertaining for me. James, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for the time. I would love to do this again. We can check in a year or so when...
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I would love to
whatever evolution of this industry, which we're both clearly so passionate about. And I'll just, thank you for listening to this episode of Your Next Chapter. I'm your host, JT. Our executive producer is Nick Kastner, edited by Justin Cortese. And we drop episodes bi-weekly. Please follow the show. And thanks for listening.